Have you ever heard an engine that sounds like it's about to explode? Like every time you hit the gas, it's one step away from blowing itself apart? That's the kind of disaster we're dealing with today, because this might be the most hated American V8 ever built. It always starts the same way. A big name, a bold idea, and a promise that this time everything is going to be different. The early 1980s were not a good time to be making cars in America. Not for Detroit, not for GM. The muscle car era had already burned out, gas prices were spiraling, and Uncle Sam was cracking down with tighter fuel economy and emissions rules. For a brand like Cadillac, which built its entire identity on massive luxury barges and big lazy V8s, that was a serious problem. They needed to look like they were evolving fast. But when you panic, you mess up. You rush things, take shortcuts, and try to fix problems without really fixing anything. And the Cadillac V8-6-4 was exactly that. A shortcut wrapped in innovation, a desperate attempt to look like the future while still hanging on to the past. It was supposed to be GM's answer to everything. Rising fuel prices, public criticism, a tightening regulatory leash. But instead of fixing those problems, it just created new ones. Ones even worse than before. Now, in theory, it sounded kind of genius. Imagine this: you are cruising down the highway in your Cadillac, a big V8 under the hood giving you that classic American power. But when you ease off the throttle, boom, it smoothly drops to 6 cylinders. Then when you're just idling, 4. You save fuel, reduce emissions, and still get all the benefits of having a proper V8 when you need it. What could possibly go wrong, right? Well, everything. Because this was not a small tweak. This was not just a new fuel map or a fancy new sensor. This was GM asking a 1980s computer. Yeah, they used a really weak computer to control a complicated engine system while the car was running. And no surprise, it could not. The V8-6-4 was based on Cadillac's existing 368 cubic inch V8, which was not exactly a marvel of engineering to begin with. They did not redesign the block or build something new from scratch. Instead, they bolted on what they called the modulated displacement system. It controlled the lifters on each cylinder through electronic solenoids, telling them when to shut off the intake and exhaust valves so those cylinders could rest. Sounds advanced, right? But here is where things start falling apart. That little system, those solenoids, sensors, actuators, all of it depended on a microprocessor about as powerful as a digital wristwatch. It had to constantly monitor driving conditions, throttle input, engine speed, and make split-second decisions to deactivate or reactivate cylinders. And it had to do it smoothly, seamlessly, invisibly. But that never happened. What drivers actually got was hesitation, misfires, jerky transitions, and in many cases, complete failure. The car would stumble trying to switch modes, then suddenly surge forward or drop out completely. Sometimes it would not switch at all. Other times it would decide, mid-corner, mid-throttle, to shut off 4 cylinders without warning. You would be driving down the road, smooth as ever, then the engine would cough, stumble. The check engine light would come on, the throttle would feel soft and unresponsive, or you would be stopped at a light and the car would just not move. It was like the engine had a personality disorder. Some days it was a V8, other days it forgot what it was entirely. And here is the wild part. Cadillac advertised this system as a selling point. They made it sound like science fiction, like you were driving the most advanced car on the road, a mechanical miracle. But under the hood, it was chaos. Glitchy, confused, and under-tested. The control system would get overwhelmed. The cylinder deactivation would not engage or disengage properly. The system had no idea what it was doing, and the driver could feel every second of it. If the system was that broken, why did GM still launch it? They knew it was not ready. Internal testing showed bugs. Dealerships reported issues almost immediately. So why roll it out? The answer: GM was in survival mode. Cadillac needed a win. The press needed headlines. The government needed proof that Detroit was making progress. The entire industry was fumbling in the dark, trying to look innovative, and GM figured they could patch it as they went. And patch it they did. This was not about solving a problem. Behind closed doors, engineers were warning the top brass that the system wasn't ready. The electronics were too crude. The testing wasn't complete. There were bugs in the software. The solenoids weren't firing in sync, but GM ignored all of it. They rushed the product to market anyway, believing that if they just got something on the road, they could always fix it with service bulletins later. It was a gamble, and a bad one. See, when a regular car breaks down, it's frustrating. But when a luxury car breaks down, one that was marketed as cutting edge and futuristic, it becomes humiliating, and that's exactly what happened. Cadillac customers were not used to their vehicles sputtering, jerking, or stalling in the middle of traffic. This was supposed to be a premium experience, but what they got was a beta test, a science project with leather seats. Owners started reporting weird behavior right out of the gate. The car would hesitate during acceleration, especially at highway speeds. The transitions between 8, 6, and 4 cylinders were clunky, unpredictable, and sometimes flat-out dangerous. The onboard computer, which was supposed to manage all of this seamlessly, would often get overwhelmed and throw the whole engine into chaos. Sometimes it would refuse to deactivate cylinders at all. Other times it would shut off half the engine when full power was needed. It was like driving with a mind of its own, and not in a good way. And remember, this was 1981. Computers were a mystery to most mechanics. Dealerships had no real tools to diagnose these problems. Technicians were baffled. They were trained to rebuild carburetors, not troubleshoot early microprocessors. So what happened next? Customers came back again and again, furious, confused, embarrassed. Dealerships were drowning in complaints. Cadillac had to issue service bulletins almost weekly, reprogramming modules, replacing sensors, updating valve timing, reflashing chips. And when all that failed, they told dealers to simply disable the system, pull the fuse, disconnect the control box, let the engine run as a regular V8 again, quietly, secretly, just pretend the whole thing never existed. And even that didn't always work. Some engines, once modified to bypass the modulated displacement system, developed new issues: valve wear, timing problems, erratic fuel delivery. The car was no longer operating as designed, and those compromises came with consequences. The whole engine architecture had been built around this system, and stripping it away created a whole new list of reliability concerns. All this for what? 2 miles per gallon? That was the supposed gain. In reality, most owners saw no improvement. Some even saw worse fuel economy, especially after the system was disabled. Imagine paying extra for a high-tech fuel-saving V8 only for it to deliver worse performance than the basic model. And let's talk about the psychological damage. Because this car didn't just break down, it broke confidence. Cadillac had always been a status symbol, something you parked proudly in your driveway. But after the V8-6-4 debacle, it became a punchline. People started to associate the name with complexity, fragility, and failure. You weren't driving a Cadillac, you were babysitting one. This engine didn't just cause short-term problems, it poisoned the well. Customers who had owned Cadillacs for decades began looking elsewhere. Lexus, BMW, Mercedes, they all seemed like safer bets. GM had not only launched a flawed product, but they had launched it at the exact moment when their competitors were perfecting their own formulas. Cadillac went from being a leader in innovation to being a warning label, and the ripple effects were brutal. By the mid-80s, Cadillac's market share had dropped dramatically. They scrambled to reinvent themselves. Smaller cars, front-wheel drive, fake wood trim, digital dashboards, but nothing landed. They had lost their identity. And all because one engine, one single engineering decision broke the bond of trust between brand and buyer. And the most tragic part? The idea wasn't even bad. Cylinder deactivation would go on to become a standard feature in many modern engines. Chrysler's MDS system, GM's active fuel management, even Honda and Volkswagen use similar concepts today. The tech works now because the processors are faster, the sensors are more accurate, and the calibration is refined. But in 1981, General Motors was using a calculator to do rocket science. If they had just waited, if they had invested more time into development, if they had tested more, trained more, held back the marketing machine just 1 year, maybe, just maybe it could have worked. Instead, they rushed it, and that rush cost them everything. What if it had worked? What if GM had launched a fully functional V8-6-4 that delivered real-world fuel savings and ran flawlessly? Would Cadillac have stayed on top? Would American luxury have never lost its footing? It's one of the great what-ifs of automotive history, because this wasn't just a bad engine, it was a turning point. One poor decision that led to decades of decline. Today, the V8-6-4 is mostly remembered as a failure. It pops up in YouTube retrospectives, Reddit threads, mechanic horror stories, and every time it's met with a shake of the head and a simple brutal takeaway: they weren't ready. And that might be the most painful part. Not that it failed, but that it failed for reasons everyone saw coming. Reasons rooted not in engineering but in ego. GM wanted to be first, but sometimes being first just means being the first to mess it up. So was the V8-6-4 the worst engine ever made? Maybe not, but it might just be the most disappointing because it had potential. And that's why even now, over 4 decades later, people still talk about it, not because it was catastrophic, but because it could have been great and wasn't. And what happened after? GM never really owned up to it. There was no public apology, no big recall. They just moved on like it never happened. The V8-6-4 quietly disappeared from the brochures, from the showrooms, and eventually from the roads, but not from memory, because this engine left a scar, not just on Cadillac, but on American car culture as a whole. People stopped trusting tech for a while. Any mention of electronic controls or smart engines was met with suspicion. For a lot of drivers, this was their first experience with computer-controlled vehicles, and it burned them badly. And you could feel the ripple effect for years. Every time GM tried something new, people would whisper about the V8-6-4. Mechanics would roll their eyes, buyers would hesitate. Even when they got it right later on, that doubt stayed in the air. Even today, you might think that a failure this big would be forgotten by now, but it is not. People still talk about the V8-6-4 in car groups, YouTube videos, and old car forums. Some owners still share their stories online, saying how much trouble it gave them. It has become kind of a warning, a funny but sad example of what happens when a company tries something new without planning properly. Believe it or not, some car collectors actually try to find this engine today, not because it is good, but because it shows how far GM was willing to go to look smart. When you open the hood, you are not just looking at a normal engine, you are looking at a strange idea that didn't work out. It was a big risk, and it failed. And here's the crazy part. If you somehow find a V8-6-4 that still works exactly the way it was made, that is very rare. Most of these engines were taken apart and the smart systems were removed. People had to do this just to make the car run properly. So now, a working V8-6-4 is not just a car part, it is a piece of history. So what does the V8-6-4 teach us? It shows that innovation without patience is dangerous. That tech is only as good as the people who test it. And that rushing a good idea can do more harm than never trying at all. It also reminds us that being first is not always the win. Sometimes the real winners are the ones who watch, wait, and get it right. And that is why even now this engine is still being talked about, not just because of how badly it failed, but because of what it took down with it, a piece of what Cadillac used to be. And in the end, the V8-6-4 is more than just a broken engine. It is a reminder of what happens when a company rushes to look smart instead of being smart. Cadillac tried to jump into the future, but they used tools that were not ready, and because of that, they paid the price. Today, car companies have learned from mistakes like this. Technology has improved, and ideas like cylinder deactivation actually work now. But back then, it was just too early. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and love hearing stories about wild car experiments and automotive disasters, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss another upload. And tell us in the comments, what do you think is the most hated engine ever made? We read every comment and your picks might show up in a future video.